Hello and welcome to the FYI podcast. That's for your ignorance. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Dr. Clint Pinehart, professor of political science, public policy, and political economy here at UTD. And today we're going to talk about the coup in Myanmar as well as what happened in the Suez Canal. So stay tuned. Hello, welcome back. This is the FYI podcast. I'm Zach Qureshi. Today I'm joined with Dr. Clint Pinehart. Hello, professor. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So first up, we're going to talk about what happened in Myanmar last month. So on February 1st, the military of the Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar seized control of the government following the landslide victory of the pro-democracy party in the election. The people of Myanmar responded by taking to the streets in a large-scale protest, to which the military-controlled government has responded with the use of water cannons, rubber bullets, and actual gunfire. Over 100 people have reportedly died since the protest began. The United States, as well as the United Kingdom and the European Union, have enacted sanctions against Myanmar to denounce the coup. Professor, in your opinion, are sanctions the right move? Is it enough to effectively incentivize the government to relinquish control, or does the West need to intervene in any other way, or how do sanctions work?
I think you can answer those questions differently. So is it the right move? Might have a different answer than whether they'll work. I think if we can take the second question first, the answer is it will not be enough to change what they're doing right now with the violence against civilian protesters. We've been through this before with Myanmar, in fact, and it was, many years that they were able to persist as a military junta, and it was, hoped that they were moving in a more democratic direction when they when Aung Suu Kyi came back to the country and became the president. But it looks like we're kind of back on the old track, I think, at some level. And the question of whether they're the right thing to do, I mean, I think I told my undergrads in my class yesterday that sometimes sanctions are a response just to do something, and they make us feel better that we're at least not standing by and watching this stuff happen. But in truth, without some sort of large-scale military intervention, I'm not sure that that it's possible to really change the direction of the way the country's going. And I don't think anybody has an appetite for large-scale military intervention on this at this point. So sanctions give us kind of a hybrid way of responding to something. They may bite a little bit depending on how widespread they are. For sanctions to be effective, they have to be multilateral. So lots of countries have to apply the sanctions, and even then, that drives up the price, the profits that somebody could make by sanction busting. And so they can actually, it's very difficult for sanctions to be truly effective, and they have to be pretty much worldwide in their scope, all other countries applying them in order for that to happen. We've seen that with North Korea for a lot of years, and it hasn't made a huge difference with North Korea because China has been willing to undercut those sanctions. So sanctions, I view as kind of a way of making us feel better about ourselves and maybe our policy choices without actually having much probability of changing things.
Yeah, for sure. So does Myanmar, what effect does it have sort of on the global economy? Is there any other reason beyond just the pure diplomatic that the United States would have for, wanting the pro-democracy party in power?
That's a great question, and I don't have statistics off the top of my head on this, but my impression is that Myanmar had been one of the most autarkic countries in the world. I mean that in an economic sense. Under the military junta previously, they had not had a lot of international ties, and companies like Pepsi got under a lot of pressure because they were operating within the country when they were under military rule before. And so they, in a pretty famous case, they had to kind of apologize and more or less back out of the country, I think. But in recent years, I'm aware of a lot of treaties that countries have negotiated with Myanmar to try to encourage international economic ties, both trade and investment. And I think they were trying to be a little bit more open to globalization and to international economic relationships with other countries. And so not clear exactly what's going to happen now. I think the sanctions certainly will prevent that from moving forward. There may be a lag before companies are willing to turn around and cut out their operations in Myanmar, but yeah, I don't think it's a huge chunk of the world economy. It was certainly moving in a more open direction, but I think everybody's going to think twice now about whether they were going to invest in Myanmar in the coming years, and probably they will have a harder time attracting the sorts of foreign firms that would have been there otherwise.
Is it at all sort of concerning that the Chinese government has refused to denounce the coup and is sort of on their side in some ways? They've been fairly supportive of sanctions in a diplomatic sense, but they're refusing to condemn them. Is you see that as a diplomatic issue?
It is, but it's probably not the biggest diplomatic issue with the U.S. and China, or with the West and with China. And certainly, under Xi Jinping, the country has been willing to kind of exert its own authority and have its own separate foreign policy, and it's not afraid to kind of fly in the face of what Western countries want anymore at all. So I think that's much clearer in North Korea and in Taiwan and in what's happened in Hong Kong in recent months. So I don't think Myanmar is a big flashpoint between U.S. and China, but certainly it's one more list of foreign policy grievances that we have against China. And it is, I think, another sign that the U.S. and China are definitely on different foreign policy courses. And I don't necessarily think that leads to war or something else, but it certainly, if I were a CEO, I would be thinking twice about all of my operations in China, given the direction of foreign policy in that country and the fact that they've just become so much more assertive about their political priorities in recent years.
That's all I have in terms of questions. Unless there's anything else you want to say on the issue, I think we can move on.
And that's
Anything?
about everything I know of Myanmar, so we can move on to something else.
So next up, we've got the Suez Canal crisis. On March 23rd, a large freight ship became stuck in the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, allowing merchants to sail between Europe to South Asia without having to sail all the way around the continent of Africa. The ship called the Ever Given became lodged between the banks of the canal, halting passage through it and bringing global trade to a standstill. The ship was finally freed about a week later on March 30th, but there remain lasting effects from the delays in trade. So, Professor, how much damage did this blockage cause, and how does one ship being stuck affect the global economy as much as it did?
So the Economist issue that comes out tomorrow is focused on this, and I'm a subscriber, so I looked at the early version of it, and I think they have a good argument that it's quite symbolic in many ways of a reaction against globalization having gone so far. One of the things about this boat is that it's one of the biggest container ships on the planet, and it is it's maybe as big as we should be building boats. I don't know. Certainly Suez crisis would suggest that. But the economist's idea is that it's a symbol of the fact that maybe globalization has just become bigger and more pronounced in its search for efficiency than we should have gone. Maybe it should come back a little bit. And so to put that in kind of more real terms, one of the things that these global supply chains have done is really focus on getting low cost components for the final products that they assemble. And as such, there often is not a lot of inventory. So when we've got the big supply and demand shocks from the COVID crisis, with masks and then vaccine components and toilet paper and all the other stuff that we've seen, one of the reasons that there were short-term problems with supply and demand is because companies tend not to keep a lot of inventory anymore. It's expensive to rent a warehouse and to keep all your extra product in the warehouse waiting for it to sell. And so since the 1970s, companies have moved more and more towards this kind of just-in-time capitalism where they don't maintain a lot of inventory. And then with global supply chains, that pushed it even farther towards specialization. And so there may be a component in a product line that's only made in one place around the planet, right? And certainly with vaccines, there are in some cases only a very few places that we can even get some of the components we need for very specialized vaccines. So I think that in general, it's going to be a rallying cry for people that believe we've gone too far towards this efficiency model and believe that we should move away from globalization. I don't think it's going to be a wholesale turnaround, and I certainly don't think the costs of just a week of blocking the canal, which I think were something like $400 million a day, based on some estimates that I saw. So that's not a huge amount. I mean, it's a big amount of money for you and me, but it's not a big amount of money for the global trading economy. So I think that ultimately it'll cause some firms to just rethink their supply chains, and they'll try to make them more resilient. And so if that means that you're going to keep a little more in warehouses, that might be the case. It might mean that some firms turn around and try to produce everything on their product line in more than, in at least two places, or something like that. And that would also handle some of the coming issues that we're going to have with climate change and the impact of flooding and rising sea levels and all that sort of thing too. So I think it makes sense. If you're a CEO, you should be thinking about this stuff. And if you're a government, you should be worried about the bigger risks that your country is going to undergo. And you should be pushing your firms to do exactly these sorts of things of just becoming more resilient. So I think that's the real lesson here.
For sure. Yeah, it's almost like, recently with the ice storm here in Texas, it sort of woke up people to a system that, when it's working smoothly, you don't even really notice it. But as soon as something goes down, it's now there's a fight for, well, we need to join the federal energy grid and things like that. So I guess my question is there really anything that, at a governmental level that needs to be done to prevent this any further, prevent something like this from happening in the future? What sort of measures need to be taken?
So we're talking about Suez still, though, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know whether the Suez Canal is in need of modernization. I know a few years ago, the Panama Canal made a big effort to deepen its waterways and widen them, in part to accommodate exactly this sort of ship. And so it may be that Suez needs a similar thing. I had never seen pictures of the Suez Canal before, and I was struck by it. I mean, it's literally just a path of water through the desert, right? I mean, there was very little kind of machinery involved or anything else. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that needs to happen, although that's way out of my wheelhouse. That's kind of a civil engineering thing, I think. But I think it does call into these broader questions of kind of the relationship between government regulation and insurance and kind of doing things that make sense over a longer term. One of the things that's not so great in democracies is that we tend to do policy making for the short term. And that's definitely, so going back to the Texas ice storm situation, I mean, it was quite clear even 10 years ago that this was a possibility, and they had the recommendations in front of them that we should winterize the power plants and spend a little money. And it really wouldn't be that much money if we spread it around to every consumer, right, over a longer period of time. Certainly it would have cost less than what we've spent on electricity during the ice storm. But so, these are always issues, and democracies are not necessarily built for great policy making. And so that's one of the downsides we see here. It requires that politicians be willing to think a little bit longer term and maybe outside their own interests, and a little bit more in terms of the greater good, which often we don't see, quite frankly.
Yeah. I guess another question I would have is that, do you think that's sort of an inevitability under capitalism, or how optimistic are you that these CEOs and these policymakers can think longer term so that a crash like this doesn't happen again?
I think there are different kinds of capitalism, first of all, so that the two big kinds are kind of shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism. And so I see the European model, not Britain, but the continental European model, being more of a stakeholder capitalism. Means that labor has input into the way the firm is governed. There are often seats on the board that belong to the labor union. Or another way of thinking about it is there are more concentrated ownership of the firm that frequently involve banks or families or something that's thinking about the longer term picture and not just about quarterly returns. The US system really does generate more of a shareholder capitalism, where the governance of the firm is focused on getting those returns out to investors as much as possible. And that tends to generate short-term thinking. And there are some pretty big kind of groups of companies that have banded together in the United States um, to call for American capitalism to mirror the kind of the European stakeholder capitalism a little bit more, and to get a little bit less focused on quarterly returns. And then if you look at some other market mechanisms, like private equity and stuff like that, some of those firms are generating similar pressures. And we also see the rise of kind of activist investors that care about things like the environment or social concerns, and that are pushing firms to do that as well. And so all of those pressures, I think, are generating a force that is propelling American capitalism to be a little bit more broad-minded and to not just think about the profit at each quarter and what is the stock market response going to be. And so I tend to think that a lot of that is good, but I think that our system still is what it is, and so the system itself still rewards the people that generate returns on the stock price. And so until we have kind of some changes in laws or adopt a system that's a little more of a hybrid and take some of the pressure off of those CEOs for the quarterly returns, I'm not sure that we're going to see much of a change in American capitalism. But again, this is kind of the interaction, not just of that, but also that plus the short-term incentives of politicians. And when you put those two things together, it's not a great combination. So it requires us to be more, just long-term in our thinking. And, a lot of these reforms or changes in governance, or however you want to think about it, make sense once you take a longer time horizon, and even the numbers make sense. And so it's not just about kind of cost cutting and that kind of thing. It's actually just what's the time horizon on the decisions you're making.
That's all I have in terms of questions. And if there's anything else you feel you need to share about the Suez Canal or the whole crisis in general?
No, I mean, if nothing else, it's given us a whole new set of memes. And so, given the COVID pandemic and our quarantines, I think probably we needed some new ones. So maybe that's the best thing it's done for all of us.
I think my favorite, I'm a big Tetris player, so I like the one that was like, how did you mess up? It's the easiest Tetris piece. It's the really long one.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I haven't seen that one. That's good.
I was surprised again, like you said, at how sort of natural the canal is, because I'm expecting, I've read about the Panama Canal having a system of lifts and all that's mechanical and all that, and then you see pictures of this boat and it's just like mud and there's one backhoe trying to push it.
Yeah, those two guys, I felt bad for them, but they definitely got internet famous overnight.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all I got. One other thing, I know you're Mandalorian fan. How did you feel about season 2?
I liked it a lot. I thought it was good, and I'm a bit stunned. I was a kid during Star Wars, so it's I went through the ups and the downs. When I was a kid, I loved it, and then George Lucas kind of ruined it with the prequels, and then now it's gotten good again. I'm a bit stunned at how many offshoots there are now in plan. Like, I mean, it's just an astonishing number of shows that they're planning to create with it. So I'm not sure they're all going to be good, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm open-minded.
For sure. Yeah, I'm also a little bit excited. I'm a huge Star Wars fan too. I just want to ask, not to get too much on Mandalorian, we can just get out of here soon. But I just want to get, I guess, I'll issue a spoiler alert before I ask the question for the last episode of season 2 of Mandalorian.
Okay.
How did you feel personally about Luke Skywalker showing up at the end?
I thought it was actually kind of effective. I didn't, again, the 8-year-old version of me or 7-year-old version of me is still in there and kind of perks up when that happens. I thought the technology of it was better than what we saw, like in the last set of movies with Leia or something like that. It didn't feel like he was, but. I mean, at some level, it would be nice if they didn't have to have everything revolve around the Skywalkers and the other families. And I'm in favor of diversifying the cast. Let's keep going, right?
I was sort of expecting it to end there, but not so soon. Like, if you think about the timeline, if he's looking for a Jedi and who's alive at this point in the timeline, and it would be around when he's starting his Jedi temple, as you see in Last Jedi. So it sort of makes sense that he ends up with Luke. But I thought that there would be several more seasons in between. He can milk more out of Mando's and his adventures with Baby Yoda. So that's my 2 cents. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for chatting with me about international issues as well as Star Wars.
My pleasure,
Thanks for
Zach.
joining me on the pod.
No problem.
Is there anything you want to shout out or plug while you're here, or?
Well, I'm excited in EPS that we have a great incoming class of assistant professors. So appreciate the provost and the dean and all of their work to allow us to hire in a year that's been a really terrible job market. And so as a result, I think we got our first choice for all 9 positions in the school. And so all the undergrads should watch for some new classes or perhaps some unfamiliar names teaching the classes that they have had previously, because we really did get some top-notch scholars, and I'm excited to have some new colleagues that are going to come in, and I think it'll inject a whole new level of energy to the school. So I think that's one thing to watch for.
Oh yeah, very cool. I'm personally an EPS major, so I look forward to that.
Great.
Can my listeners find you on Twitter anywhere?
Yes, I actually have a Twitter account, and I mostly use it to just kind of as a placeholder for stuff that I read. But if you're interested in international affairs, that's mostly what I'm tweeting about. So you'll find some good stories there, if and maybe an occasional soccer story as well.
Cool. Thanks again for being on the show, and to everybody listening, thanks for listening. I've been your host, Zach Qureshi. Thanks for listening again, and as always, peace in the Mideast.
You can wish for, yes, as always, for sure.